Beneath the subterranean observation deck, the air tasted of ozone and failure. For 800 standard cycles, the Grand Archive of the First Fleet had sat in the center of this sterile quarantine bay, an impenetrable monolith of dead quantum glass. And 40 of the most decorated Vennari scholars had dedicated their entire lifespans to coaxing a single byte of data from its fractured circuits. We had deployed light refraction arrays, temporal-stasis fields, and microscopic surgical drones. We had all failed. I, Kalen, High Scholar of the 7th Disciplinary Caste, was merely the latest academic to inherit this grand, silent defeat. The archive held the surrender codes required to stand down the automated dreadnoughts currently encircling our core worlds, yet its command pathways were physically severed at the microscopic level, a low hum. Then nothing. We brought the human in solely to catalogue the structural decay before we officially abandoned the sector to the automated fleet. Archivist Sullivan was a compact, intensely quiet primate who moved with an economy of motion that made my own sensory tendrils twitch. He had spent his developmental cycles in a subterranean museum on his homeworld, piecing together disintegrating cellulose manuscripts with nothing but adhesives and patience. To him, our fading archive was not a divine weapon. It was just another broken book. He stood over the main console under the harsh fluorescent light. The dry, rasping sound of the human blowing 8 centuries of accumulated silicate dust off his knuckles echoed through the silent cavern. It was an irreverent, aggressively physical gesture. Would you have allowed a creature from a Class 2 world to lay bare hands on the galaxy's most dangerous relic? Because we were desperate enough to look the other way. My datapad registered the anomaly exactly 12 seconds later. The central quantum bridge, a microscopic valley of shattered crystalline pathways that had registered absolute zero conductivity since the last galactic war, suddenly flared on my screen. The numbers rolled over with violent speed. Absolute zero, 45%, 89%, 100% signal transmission. A perfect unbroken circuit. My secondary respiratory gills flared wide, drawing in cold, sterilized air as the impossible data stabilized. How could a physical void, a gap too small for our finest autonomous tech mites to weld, be instantly bypassed without triggering the archive's catastrophic security purge? The readouts offered no explanation, only the terrifying reality of a dead machine waking up. To understand the humiliation of that data, one must look at the moments just prior and the tool the human had extracted from his canvas satchel. Sullivan did not produce a laser-sintering pen or a nanite delivery syringe. He pulled out a wooden cylinder painted a dull, flaking yellow. It was a pencil, a primitive, obsolete marking stick tipped with crude graphite. The assembled Vennari scholars emitted a collective harmonic frequency of disdain, a sound like grinding stone. One of my junior researchers, a specialist in subatomic restructuring, actually turned his visual receptors away in disgust. To the Vennari, precision was a religion. My own dermal plating flushed a deep violet, signaling my professional embarrassment at having invited this primate to our most sacred failure. We were dealing with subatomic fissures in a command relay, and this archivist was holding a tool designed to scrape carbon against pressed pulp. I stepped forward, modulating my vocal cords to project maximum authority into the cavernous space. Archivist Sullivan, our most advanced quantum decryption matrices couldn't bridge the structural fissures, meaning that any physical intervention would simply, a harsh, rhythmic scratching sound, cut me off. Sullivan hadn't even looked up. He was leaning directly over the exposed volatile core of the archive, his face mere millimeters from the dead circuits. His jaw was set in a rigid line of absolute focus. He had pressed the tip of the yellow wood and carbon tool directly against the exposed glass of the fractured quantum bridge. He was rubbing the graphite aggressively back and forth across the physical gap in the hardware. The friction of the primitive stick against the glass produced a grating noise that set my sensory tendrils vibrating with acute distress. He was effectively treating a weapon of mass planetary destruction like a torn page in a children's primer. I extended my upper manipulators, preparing to physically drag him away from the console before his crude friction detonated the quarantine bay. Kalen stepped forward to physically restrain the human, his upper manipulators extending toward the console. The human's grip on the primitive instrument was unyielding. The dull yellow paint, flaking off the wooden barrel of the number 2 pencil as it was gripped tightly, caught the harsh fluorescent light. A stark contrast to the gleaming dead quantum glass beneath it. Sullivan was not repairing the crystalline pathway. He was ignoring it entirely. Graphite is a highly ordered crystalline form of carbon. By forcing the soft mineral against the abrasive edge of the shattered quantum bridge, the Archivist was shearing off microscopic sheets of conductive atoms. He was packing the subatomic canyon with compressed carbon dust, brute forcing a physical bridge where digital algorithms had found no purchase. It was a friction-based deposition of raw conductive material, executed with the blunt force of a primate's hand. The primary console began to vibrate. This was the anomaly. This was the exact origin of the impossible data spike that would register on Kaelin's datapad 12 seconds later. The 0% conductivity reading was vanishing, replaced by the chaotic, surging flow of a fully reconnected circuit. Kaelin looked down at his diagnostic slate, his visual receptors struggling to process the sudden influx of raw telemetry. The metabolic feedback, the archive is drawing power, but the circuit is completely. A deafening mechanical roar shattered the quiet. The cavern flooded with light. As the archive drew its first breath in 8 centuries, a shockwave of ambient kinetic energy washed over the observation deck, overloading their specialized absorptive physiology and dropping 40 of the galaxy's most decorated scholars to the polished metallic floor in absolute paralyzing agony. Vennari bodies were designed to passively absorb and process localized energy, making them exceptional operators of delicate technology, making them acceptable operators and process, calipharded Bapas, but they had never evolved to withstand the metabolic feedback of a planetary defense network. Waking up all at once, Kaelin lay pressed against the cold grating, his dermal plating flashing in chaotic distressed rhythms. Through the searing pain in his sensory tendrils, he watched the human. Sullivan had not fallen. He had merely taken a half-step back from the console to avoid the initial heat bloom. The Archivist stood casually amidst the blinding light of the resurrected archive and the groaning forms of the Vennari elite. He blew a loose flake of carbon off the console. Then, he tapped the blunted end of his wooden stick against his palm. "We learned this in grade school," Sullivan said. The words hung in the superheated air. Kaelin forced his primary respiratory gills to cycle, fighting through the biological overload to stare at the primate. A terrifying clarity settled over the high scholar. Earth was a volatile, hostile rock. It was a world that casually rotated its inhabitants through a highly charged stellar radiation belt on a daily basis. A species forged in such a brutal, constant state of environmental degradation wouldn't rely on perfect, fragile crystalline matrices to survive. They would rely on dirt, on carbon, on friction and force. They understood the raw, fundamental elements of the universe because they were still forced to fight them every single day. The central holographic projector ignited, casting a towering 3-dimensional prompt across the cavern ceiling. The automated dreadnought fleet, detecting the sudden activation of the Grand Archive, paused its orbital bombardment sequence. The system was demanding authorization. It was waiting for the surrender codes, waiting. Kaelin pushed himself onto his lower manipulators, his voice trembling not from fear, but from the clinical, crushing weight of absolute defeat. He looked at the vast projection, then down at the simple yellow marking stick resting in the human's hand. "Stand down," Kaelin ordered the fleet. "All of you, now." The yellow pencil rested on a pristine velvet cushion inside the central containment field. Its tip was heavily worn, the dull graphite blunted by friction, yet it remained the most vital artifact in the quadrant. Beneath Kaelin's feet, the steady, rhythmic hum of vibration in the deck plates signaled the retreat of 1,000 automated dreadnoughts. A primitive marking stick had drawn the line between extinction and tomorrow.